The hallways of Lincoln High were always loud. Students rushed between classes, lockers slammed shut, and groups of friends laughed and shouted to each other across the crowded corridors. In the middle of all this noise, there was one person who seemed almost invisible. His name was David, and he was 17 years old. He walked with his head down, wearing the same faded jacket he'd worn since freshman year. His backpack was old and patched with duct tape on one corner. The other kids didn't really notice him much. He wasn't popular. He wasn't an athlete. He wasn't in any clubs. He was just there, moving through the school day like a shadow. David lived with his mom in a small apartment on the east side of town. His mom worked as a waitress at Joe's Diner, pulling double shifts most days just to pay the bills. His father had left when David was 9, and his mom never talked about him. Money was always tight, really tight. There were nights when dinner was just rice and whatever vegetables were on sale that week. New clothes were a luxury they couldn't afford. David wore hand-me-downs from donation bins and thrift stores, but David had a secret. Something nobody at school knew about. Something that made him feel alive in ways nothing else could. He loved music. Not just listening to it, but creating it. And more than anything else in the world, he loved playing the piano. It started when he was 12. He'd been walking past the community center after school one day and heard the most beautiful sound coming from inside. He peeked through the window and saw an old man playing an upright piano, his fingers dancing across the keys. David stood there for nearly an hour, completely mesmerized until the man finished and left. The next day he came back. And the day after that, eventually the old man noticed him watching and invited him inside. His name was Mr. Rodriguez, and he'd been a music teacher for 40 years before retiring. He showed David the basics, let him touch the keys, taught him a simple melody. Mr. Rodriguez passed away 2 years later, but he'd given David something precious. A love for the piano that burned like fire inside him. The problem was David couldn't afford piano lessons. His mom barely made enough to keep them fed and housed. A real piano was completely out of the question. Even a decent keyboard cost hundreds of dollars they didn't have. So David taught himself. He spent hours in the school library, reading books about music theory. He watched free tutorials on his phone, which had a cracked screen from when he'd dropped it last year. He couldn't afford to fix it, but it still worked well enough to watch videos. He'd pause and rewind the same section over and over, memorizing finger positions and techniques. And every single day during lunch period, while other students hung out in the cafeteria or outside on the quad, David slipped away to the old music room. The music room was at the far end of the building, past the gymnasium and down a hallway most students never used. It was dusty and filled with old instruments that the school had replaced years ago. Band practice happened in the new music center on the other side of campus. This room was forgotten, abandoned, but it had one thing David needed. An old upright piano pushed against the back wall. The piano was out of tune. Some of the keys stuck. The wood was scratched and faded. But to David, it was perfect. It was his escape, his sanctuary. He'd eat his lunch quickly, usually just a sandwich his mom had packed that morning, and then spend the rest of the period at that piano. His fingers would move across the keys, practicing scales, working through pieces he'd learned from videos, or just experimenting with melodies that came into his head. The music transported him somewhere else. When he played, he wasn't the poor kid in the patched jacket. He wasn't the invisible boy everyone ignored. He was an artist, a creator, someone with something valuable to offer the world, even if nobody else knew it yet. David kept his passion completely private. He never told anyone about his playing. He never mentioned it in class or to the few classmates who occasionally spoke to him. It felt too precious, too personal to share. And honestly, he was afraid of being judged, afraid of being laughed at. That fear wasn't unfounded. One afternoon in English class, David was working on an assignment when he realized he'd grabbed the wrong notebook from his backpack. Instead of his English notes, he'd pulled out the notebook where he wrote music. Pages and pages of handwritten sheet music, chord progressions, and notes to himself about techniques he wanted to master. Before he could switch notebooks, the girl sitting next to him glanced over and saw what he was working on. Her name was Ashley, and she was one of the popular kids. Captain of the dance team, always surrounded by friends. She looked at the music notes on his paper with obvious confusion. What is that? she asked, loud enough that several other students turned to look. David's face went hot. He quickly closed the notebook. Nothing, just nothing. But it was too late. Ashley had already caught the attention of Tyler, who sat in the row behind them. Tyler was the star of the basketball team, tall and confident, the kind of guy who seemed to coast through life on natural charm and athletic ability. "What's going on?" Tyler asked, leaning forward. "David's got some weird drawings in his notebook," Ashley said, though not meanly. She seemed more curious than cruel. "They're not drawings," David mumbled. "It's music." The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Tyler's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, you write music? Like you're in a band or something?" "No, I play piano sometimes," Tyler laughed. Not a mean laugh exactly, but surprised, disbelieving. "You? Piano?" Other students were listening now. David felt their eyes on him. His hands were shaking slightly as he shoved the notebook back into his bag. "Yeah, I didn't know you did anything like that," Ashley said. She still didn't sound mean, just genuinely shocked that quiet, invisible David had any hobbies at all. By the end of the day, word had spread. Not in a huge way, but enough that people were aware. David, the weird, quiet kid, apparently played piano. Some students asked him about it. Most seemed skeptical. A few made jokes, imitating exaggerated piano-playing motions with dramatic facial expressions in the hallway. David heard the whispers and saw the smirks. He felt his secret sanctuary crumbling. The one thing that was entirely his own was now public knowledge, and it felt exposed and vulnerable. That night, lying in bed in the small room he'd lived in his entire life, David stared at the ceiling and made a decision. He wouldn't let their doubt matter. He wouldn't let their skepticism define what he could or couldn't do. He thought about his mom, sleeping in the next room after another exhausting shift at the diner. He thought about all the hours she worked just to give him a roof over his head and food to eat. He thought about Mr. Rodriguez, who'd believed in him when he was just a curious kid peeking through a window. And he thought about the music, the way it made him feel, the way it gave him purpose. Whatever happened next, whatever anyone thought or said, David knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop playing. Not for anyone. The piano was his voice. And someday, somehow, he was going to make sure people heard it. Monday morning started like any other day. David walked into school with his backpack slung over one shoulder, trying to blend into the crowd as usual. But something felt different. He could sense it in the way people looked at him, the quick glances followed by whispered conversations. The news about his piano playing had spread more than he'd realized. It wasn't that everyone was talking about him, but enough people knew. And most of them seemed to find it amusing. David playing piano, the quiet kid who never spoke up in class, who ate lunch alone, who wore the same worn-out clothes every week. It just didn't fit the image they had of him. During third period, David was sitting in history class when the principal's voice came over the intercom. She was making announcements about upcoming events, sports scores, club meetings, the usual stuff. But then she said something that made David's heart skip a beat. "Don't forget about this year's annual talent show," Principal Hayes announced, her voice crackling through the old speakers. "It's happening 3 weeks from Friday. This year's grand prize is a $5,000 scholarship, donated by the Riverside Community Foundation. All students are welcome to audition. Sign-up sheets are posted outside the main office." The classroom erupted in excited chatter. $5,000 was serious money. David's mind immediately went to his mom. That much money could cover months of rent. It could fix their car, which had been making strange noises for weeks. It could mean his mom wouldn't have to work double shifts for a while. But the thought of performing in front of the entire school made his stomach turn. Standing on that stage exposed and vulnerable, with hundreds of eyes watching him, judging him, it terrified him. At lunch, David headed to his usual spot in the old music room. But as he walked down the hallway, he heard voices behind him. "Hey, David, wait up." He turned to see Tyler and 2 of his friends from the basketball team. David's first instinct was to keep walking, but Tyler jogged up to him with what looked like a genuine smile on his face. "So, you gonna sign up for the talent show?" Tyler asked. David hesitated. "I don't know. Probably not. Come on, man. $5,000? That's a lot of money." One of Tyler's friends, a tall guy named Kevin, chuckled. "What would you even do? Play piano?" He said it like it was a joke, like the idea was ridiculous. Tyler elbowed him. Shut up, Kevin, I'm being serious. He looked back at David. You should do it. I mean, if you're actually good. There it was. That doubt. That unspoken question hanging in the air. If you're actually good. They didn't believe he could really play. They thought it was probably just a hobby, something he did badly in his free time. I'll think about it, David said quietly, and walked away before they could say anything else. In the music room, David sat at the old piano and tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to the talent show. $5,000. That money could change everything for his mom. He thought about how tired she looked lately, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands shook sometimes from exhaustion. He wanted to do it. He wanted to try, but the fear was overwhelming. That afternoon, David walked past the main office on his way out of school. There was already a crowd of students around the sign-up sheet for the talent show. He watched from a distance as people wrote their names, laughing and chatting excitedly about what they were going to perform. Ashley was there with her dance team friends, signing up for a group routine. Tyler was putting his name down for a basketball trick shot demonstration. Other kids were planning comedy sketches, songs, magic tricks. Everyone seemed so confident, so sure of themselves. David stood there for a long time just watching. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he walked up to the sheet and wrote his name at the bottom. David Chen. Piano performance. His hand was shaking so badly that his handwriting looked messy. But it was done. He'd committed almost immediately. He regretted it. What was he thinking? He wasn't ready for this. He'd taught himself everything from videos and old books. He'd never had real lessons. He'd never performed for anyone except himself. This was a mistake. A huge mistake. But when he got home that evening and saw his mom sitting at their tiny kitchen table sorting through bills with worry written all across her face, he knew he couldn't back out. He had to at least try. The next few days at school were rough. Word got around that David had signed up for the talent show, and people had opinions about it. Most weren't mean about it exactly. They were just skeptical, surprised. Some seemed to think it was brave. Others thought it was foolish. During lunch on Wednesday, David overheard a conversation in the hallway outside the music room. He recognized the voices immediately. Tyler and his friends. I'm telling you, this is going to be embarrassing, Kevin was saying. The guy probably plays like a 5-year-old at their first recital. You don't know that, Tyler said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Maybe he's actually good. Come on. Look at him. He's not exactly, I don't know, he just doesn't seem like a performer, you know what I mean? Another voice joined in. My sister saw him in the old music room once. She said he was playing something, but she couldn't really tell if it was good or not. The piano's so out of tune. They kept talking, but David had heard enough. He sat at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys, feeling a mix of anger and shame burning in his chest. They were already writing him off. Already deciding he was going to fail. That night, David made a decision. He was going to practice harder than he'd ever practiced before. Every free moment he had would go into preparing for this performance. He couldn't afford to mess this up. Not just because of the scholarship money, but because he needed to prove something. To them, to himself. For the next 2 weeks, David's life became all about the piano. He arrived at school early every morning to practice in the music room before classes started. He spent every lunch period there. He stayed late after school until the janitor finally kicked him out so he could lock up the building. At home, he practiced on the old keyboard his mom had bought him 2 Christmases ago. It wasn't the same as a real piano, but it was better than nothing. He worked on technique, on dynamics, on making every note perfect. His mom noticed the change. One evening, she sat down next to him while he was practicing. Baby, you're working yourself too hard, she said gently, putting a hand on his shoulder. I can hear you playing until midnight some nights. I have to be ready, Mom. The talent show is in 1 week. She looked at him with those tired eyes, and he could see both pride and worry there. I know that scholarship money would help us. But David, you don't have to do this. We'll be okay. We always figure it out. I want to do this, he said, and he meant it. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about showing everyone what he was capable of. About stepping out of the shadows and being seen for who he really was. As the days counted down to the talent show, the buzz around school grew. Posters went up in the hallways. Teachers talked about it in class. Everyone seemed excited about it, everyone except David, who felt nothing but pure, gut-wrenching terror mixed with determination. He'd chosen his piece carefully, something challenging enough to showcase his skills, but not so difficult that he'd mess it up under pressure. 3 days before the show, during lunch period, the door to the music room opened. David looked up from the piano, expecting to see the janitor or maybe a lost student. It was Mrs. Patterson, the music teacher from the new building. She was young, maybe in her 30s, with kind eyes and a reputation for being tough but fair. "I heard you're performing in the talent show," she said, walking into the room. David nodded, suddenly feeling very self-conscious. "Mind if I listen?" His heart hammered in his chest. This was a real music teacher, someone who actually knew what good piano playing sounded like, but he couldn't say no. "Okay," he whispered. Mrs. Patterson sat down in one of the old chairs and David began to play. His hands were shaking at first, but once he got into the music, everything else faded away. He poured everything he had into that performance, just like he'd been practicing. When he finished, there was silence. David was too afraid to look at her face. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke. "David, how long have you been taking lessons?" "I haven't," he admitted. "I taught myself." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head slowly. "That's remarkable. You have real talent." David felt a surge of hope. But then she continued, "But I have to be honest with you. Talent shows are tricky. The audience might not appreciate classical piano. They usually prefer things that are more entertaining, more flashy. I just don't want you to be disappointed if things don't go the way you hope." She meant well. David could see that. But her words planted seeds of doubt that grew and grew as the talent show got closer. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was all a mistake. The day of the talent show arrived faster than David expected. He barely slept the night before, tossing and turning in bed, running through the piece in his mind over and over again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw himself on stage, his fingers freezing up, forgetting everything he'd practiced. The nightmares felt so real that he woke up several times in a cold sweat. His mom made him breakfast that morning, though he could barely eat. Toast and egg sat on his plate untouched while he stared blankly at the table. "You're going to be amazing," his mom said, reaching across to squeeze his hand. She'd requested the evening off from the diner, something she almost never did. Losing those hours meant losing money they desperately needed, but she insisted. "I wouldn't miss this for the world," she'd told him. That made David feel even more pressure. His mom was sacrificing her wages just to watch him perform. What if he completely messed up? What if he embarrassed himself in front of the whole school and disappointed her too? School that day was torture. David couldn't focus in any of his classes. Teachers called on him and he had no idea what they'd asked. His mind was somewhere else entirely, trapped in an endless loop of anxiety and fear. At lunch, he went to the music room one last time. His fingers moved across the familiar keys of the old piano, but something felt off. He kept making small mistakes, stumbling over passages he'd played perfectly just yesterday. The more he tried to fix them, the worse it got. "Stop it," he whispered to himself. "Just stop." He put his hands in his lap and took several deep breaths. Mrs. Patterson's words kept echoing in his head. The audience might not appreciate classical piano. They usually prefer things that are more entertaining. What if she was right? What if everyone just sat there bored while he played? Or worse, what if they laughed? The final bell rang at 3 o'clock. The talent show would start at 7. David had 4 hours to somehow pull himself together. He went home and tried to rest, but rest was impossible. He sat on his bed, then stood up and paced. He tried to practice on his keyboard, but his hands were shaking too much. Finally, his mom came into his room at 6 o'clock. "Time to get ready, sweetheart." David put on the only nice clothes he owned, a button-up shirt from the thrift store that was slightly too big, and a pair of dark pants his mom had bought him last year for a cousin's wedding. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the scared kid staring back at him. They drove to school in their old car, the engine making that rattling sound it always made. His mom kept trying to make conversation, but David could only manage one-word answers. The fear had completely taken over now. His stomach was in knots. His palms were sweaty. His heart wouldn't stop racing. The parking lot was packed. It seemed like everyone in town had shown up for the talent show. As David walked toward the school entrance with his mom, he saw students and parents streaming into the building, all excited and chatting happily. Inside, the hallway near the auditorium was chaos. Performers were running around in costumes, doing last-minute rehearsals, checking props and equipment. David checked in with Mr. Phillips, the drama teacher who was coordinating everything. "Ah, David, you're performing 12th in the lineup. That's almost right in the middle. Head backstage when you're ready. 12th. He had to sit through 11 other performances first, watching and waiting and letting the anxiety build. David nodded and made his way backstage with the other performers. The backstage area was cramped and buzzing with nervous energy. Ashley and her dance team were stretching in matching outfits, going over their routine in whispers. Tyler was practicing his basketball moves with an actual basketball, which seemed like a safety hazard in such a tight space. A girl David didn't know very well was singing scales to warm up her voice. Everyone seemed so prepared, so confident. David felt completely out of place. At 7 o'clock sharp, Principal Hayes walked out onto the stage to thunderous applause. David peeked through the curtain and saw the auditorium was completely packed. Every seat was filled. People were even standing in the back. His mom was sitting in the 5th row, right in the center. She'd gotten there early to get a good seat. When she saw him peeking out, she waved and gave him a big smile. David tried to smile back, but his face felt frozen. The show began. The first act was a comedy sketch performed by 3 senior guys. They had the audience roaring with laughter. Then came a girl singing a pop song, her voice clear and beautiful. Then a magic act that had everyone gasping and clapping. Each performance seemed better than the last. The energy in the auditorium was electric. People were cheering, whooping, applauding. Everyone was having an amazing time. David watched from backstage, and with each act that finished, his confidence crumbled a little more. These performances were incredible. They were entertaining. They were exactly what Mrs. Patterson had said the audience wanted, and he was going to play classical piano. On an out-of-tune piano, with no flashy lights or backup dancers or jokes, just him and the music. Tyler's basketball demonstration came up 8th. He did all sorts of trick shots, spinning the ball, making impossible throws that somehow went in. The crowd went wild. Tyler walked off stage grinning, high-fiving his friends. Then Ashley's dance team performed. Their routine was sharp, synchronized perfectly, set to a popular song everyone knew. The audience clapped along with the beat. When they finished with a dramatic final pose, the applause was deafening. David was up in 2 more acts. His hands had gone completely numb. He flexed his fingers, trying to get the feeling back, but the numbness spread up his arms. This was bad. Really bad. The 11th performer finished, a guy doing a drum solo that had people on their feet. Then Mr. Phillips appeared next to David. "You're up next. Good luck out there." David walked to the side of the stage on legs that felt like rubber. He could hear Principal Hayes announcing him. "Our next performer is David Chen playing piano. Let's give him a warm welcome." The applause was polite but notably quieter than it had been for the previous acts. David walked out onto the stage and immediately the bright lights blinded him. He couldn't see the audience clearly anymore, just dark shapes and the occasional flash of a phone camera. The piano sat center stage, a beautiful grand piano that the school used for concerts. It was nothing like the beaten-up upright he'd been practicing on. For a moment, David just stood there frozen. Then he heard it. Laughter. Quiet at first, scattered throughout the audience. Then a little louder. Someone had said something he couldn't make out, and it had made people laugh. Were they laughing at him? At his too big shirt? At the idea of him performing? David's face burned. He forced himself to walk to the piano bench and sit down. His vision was blurring. He couldn't tell if it was from the bright lights or from tears threatening to form. Maybe both. He looked down at the keys. They seemed to swim before his eyes. This was it. The moment he'd been dreading. He was about to humiliate himself in front of the entire school, in front of his mom who'd sacrificed so much just to be here. More laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back yelled something that sounded like "Play Twinkle Twinkle," and several people laughed. David wanted to run. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to just get up and walk off that stage. He could pretend he was sick. He could say he forgot the piece. Anything would be better than sitting here being laughed at. But then something strange happened. In the middle of all that fear and humiliation, David thought about Mr. Rodriguez, the old man who'd first shown him the piano all those years ago. He remembered what Mr. Rodriguez had told him during one of their lessons. Music isn't about being perfect, David. It's about being honest. When you play, you're sharing a piece of your soul. Don't ever be ashamed of that. David lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. They were cool and smooth under his fingertips. The feel of them, so familiar yet so different from what he was used to, grounded him somehow. He took one long, deep breath, then another. The laughter was dying down now. The audience was waiting to see what he would do, and then, with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest, David began to play. The first notes came out soft and gentle like a whisper. They floated across the auditorium, delicate and pure. David kept his eyes closed, blocking out everything except the music. He'd chosen to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was beautiful and melancholic, full of emotion, but he'd also arranged a transition into something more contemporary, a piece he'd written himself that blended classical technique with a modern melody. As his fingers moved across the keys, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it transformed into something else. Energy. Focus. Purpose. The laughter had stopped. David could feel it even with his eyes closed. The auditorium had gone completely silent. Not the restless silence of a bored audience, but the breathless silence of people paying attention. He pressed into the keys with more confidence now, letting the music build. The notes filled every corner of that auditorium, rich and full on this beautiful instrument. His fingers flew across the keys, executing runs and trills he'd practiced thousands of times. The piece moved through different emotions. Gentle moments that felt like sadness, powerful moments that felt like hope, complex passages that showcased every bit of skill he'd developed over years of teaching himself. David poured everything into that performance. All his frustration at being invisible, all his love for his hardworking mom, all his dreams of a better life, all his fear and hope and determination. It all came out through the music. When he transitioned into his own composition, the melody shifted into something unexpected. Something that made the classical piece feel fresh and new. He'd taken inspiration from modern songs he loved, but kept the sophisticated piano work that made classical music so powerful. The music swelled and dipped, fast, then slow, loud, then soft. David's whole body moved with it, swaying slightly, completely lost in the performance. And then, after what felt like both seconds and hours, he played the final note. It hung in the air, vibrating, slowly fading into silence. David opened his eyes. His hands were still on the keys. His breathing was heavy. Sweat dripped down his forehead. For a moment, nothing happened. The auditorium was completely silent. David's heart sank. They hated it. They didn't understand it. He'd failed. But then the silence broke. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. But to David, sitting at that piano with his heart racing and his hands still trembling on the keys, it felt like an eternity. 3 seconds where he was sure he'd failed. 3 seconds where he thought about how he'd just embarrassed himself and his mom in front of everyone. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first. David couldn't see who it was through the bright stage lights. But that single person was clapping slowly, deliberately, and then another person joined in. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was thunder. The sound hit David like a physical wave. People weren't just clapping. They were on their feet. All of them. Students, teachers, parents, everyone. Standing and applauding and cheering. David sat frozen on the bench, completely overwhelmed. He couldn't process what was happening. This couldn't be real. People were whistling. Someone was shouting, "Yeah!" over and over. The noise was deafening. Through the crowd, David spotted his mom. She was standing with her hands clasped over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. When she saw him looking, she started clapping even harder, her whole face glowing with pride and joy. Principal Hayes had to come out on stage and motion for people to quiet down. It took almost a full minute before the applause died down enough for her to speak. "Well," she said into the microphone, her own voice thick with emotion, "I think it's safe to say that was something special. David Chen, everyone." The applause started up again. David stood shakily and gave an awkward little bow, unsure of what else to do. His legs felt weak. His mind was spinning. As he walked off stage, kids he'd never spoken to were reaching out to pat his shoulder or give him high fives. Backstage, the other performers were staring at him with wide eyes. Ashley rushed over, her face bright with excitement. "David!" "Oh my God, that was incredible. I had no idea you could play like that." Tyler was right behind her. "Dude, seriously, that was insane. Like actual professional level stuff." More people crowded around him, all talking at once. David couldn't keep track of who was saying what. The girl who'd sung earlier told him she'd gotten chills. One of the guys from the comedy sketch said he'd recorded it on his phone. A teacher David didn't even know came backstage just to shake his hand. The rest of the talent show continued, but David barely registered any of it. He was in a daze, trying to understand what had just happened. When all the acts were finished, the judges deliberated for about 10 minutes while everyone waited. Then Principal Hayes returned to the stage with an envelope. "The judges have made their decision. But before we announce the winner, I want to say that every single performer tonight showed tremendous courage and talent. You should all be proud of yourselves." David's stomach clenched. He was sitting in the audience now next to his mom, holding her hand. Part of him didn't even care about winning anymore. The reaction he'd gotten, the way people had responded to his music, that was already more than he'd ever dreamed of. And the winner of this year's talent show, and the $5,000 scholarship is... Principal Hayes paused for dramatic effect. "David Chen." The auditorium exploded again. David felt his mom pull him into a tight hug, both of them crying now. Students around him were clapping and cheering. Someone behind him slapped him on the back so hard he almost fell forward. In a blur, he was back on stage, shaking Principal Hayes' hand, accepting a check that felt surreal in his hands. $5,000. $5,000 that would help his mom. That would ease the burden she carried every single day. After the show ended, David was swarmed. Parents he'd never met came up to compliment him. Teachers stopped to tell him how moved they were. Students who'd never acknowledged his existence before suddenly wanted to talk to him, to take pictures with him, to be his friend. It was overwhelming. Wonderful, but overwhelming. His mom stayed close to him, her hand on his shoulder, beaming with pride. Mrs. Patterson found them in the crowd. "David, I owe you an apology. I underestimated you. That was genuinely one of the most impressive performances I've seen from a high school student. Have you thought about pursuing music seriously?" David shook his head. He hadn't thought about anything beyond making it through the performance without passing out. "Well, you should," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "I'd like to talk to you next week about some opportunities. There are programs, scholarships for music school, real ones. With your talent, you could go far." After what felt like hours, the crowd finally thinned out. David and his mom walked to their car in the quiet parking lot. The night air felt cool and fresh after the stuffiness of the auditorium. "I'm so proud of you, baby," his mom said softly, putting her arm around his shoulders as they walked. "You worked so hard for this. You earned every bit of it." David leaned against her. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. All those times you encouraged me, all the sacrifices you made. The keyboard you bought me even though we couldn't really afford it. This win is as much yours as it is mine." She wiped her eyes. "I just want you to be happy. To chase your dreams. You have something special, David. Tonight you showed everyone what I've always known. You're extraordinary." That weekend was surreal. The video of David's performance spread through the school's social media like wildfire. By Monday morning, it had thousands of views. Students who'd never noticed him before were stopping him in the hallways to congratulate him. Teachers were smiling at him. Even the school janitor, Mr. Williams, pulled him aside to tell him the performance was beautiful. But the most surprising change came from Tyler. On Tuesday morning, Tyler found David in the hallway before first period. "Hey, can we talk for a minute?" David nodded, expecting. He wasn't sure what. Maybe some backhanded compliment or joke. Instead, Tyler looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Look, I need to apologize. Before the talent show, I said some stuff. About you, about your playing. I didn't think you could actually do it. I judged you without even knowing you, and that was wrong. That performance, man, it was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. You made me feel something with that music. I didn't even know piano could do that." David was stunned. "Thanks, that means a lot. I'm serious. And I'm sorry, not just for what I said, but for never bothering to get to know you before. If you ever want to hang out or grab lunch or whatever, I'd like that." It was awkward, but it felt genuine. David agreed, and over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. He and Tyler actually became friends. Real friends. Tyler introduced him to other people, and suddenly, David had a social circle for the first time in his high school career. But the biggest surprise came 3 weeks after the talent show. David was called to the principal's office during third period. His heart jumped. Had he done something wrong? When he arrived, Principal Hayes was sitting at her desk with a man in a suit that David didn't recognize. Both of them were smiling. "David, please sit down," Principal Hayes said warmly. "This is Professor Mitchell from the State University School of Music." The man stood and shook David's hand. His grip was firm and friendly. "It's wonderful to meet you, David. I've watched the video of your performance at least a dozen times. It's remarkable." "Thank you," David managed to say, completely confused about what was happening. Professor Mitchell sat back down. "I'll get straight to the point. The School of Music is prepared to offer you a full scholarship if you choose to attend after graduation. Full tuition, room and board, and a stipend for expenses. We'd also like to pair you with one of our best piano instructors for private lessons." David's mouth fell open. He couldn't speak. This couldn't be real. "This is contingent on maintaining your grades and continuing to develop your musical skills, of course," Professor Mitchell continued. "But from what I've seen and heard, I have no doubt you'll exceed all expectations. You have a rare gift, David. Real artistry combined with technical skill. That's not something that can be taught. You either have it or you don't, and you have it. I don't know what to say," David whispered. Principal Hayes laughed gently. "You don't have to decide right now. Take some time to think about it. Talk it over with your mother. But David, this is an incredible opportunity, one that could change your life." That evening, David told his mom everything. They sat in their small apartment, the one they'd lived in for years, and talked about the future. His mom cried again, but these were happy tears. "You can do this," she said. "You can go to that university and study music and become everything you're meant to be. But what about you?" David asked. "What about the rent? Your job?" She smiled and took his hands in hers. "Baby, you let me worry about that. This is your chance. Your one shot at making your dreams come true. I'll figure things out. I always do. What matters is you taking this opportunity and running with it." Over the next few months, David's life transformed completely. Local newspapers ran stories about him. A few small businesses in town even contributed to a fund to help his mom with expenses, moved by his story and his talent. Mrs. Patterson started giving him lessons after school, refusing to accept payment. "Consider it an investment in your future," she said. David practiced harder than ever, not out of fear this time, but out of pure love for the music. He was finally able to pursue his passion openly, without hiding, without shame. The kid who'd once been invisible was now seen. The boy everyone had laughed at had proven them all wrong, not through anger or revenge, but through dedication, talent, and the courage to be himself even when it was terrifying. And every time David sat down at a piano now, whether it was the old upright in the music room or the beautiful grand piano in Mrs. Patterson's classroom, he felt grateful. Grateful for the journey. Grateful for the people who believed in him. Grateful for the music that had saved him and given him a voice when he thought he had none. The talent show had been just the beginning. The real story was what came after, and that story was far from over. 6 months had passed since the talent show, and David's life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. But not everything changed overnight. Some mornings he still woke up expecting to be the invisible kid walking through the hallways with his head down. Then he'd remember. That wasn't his life anymore. The scholarship money from the talent show had made an immediate difference. His mom was able to fix their car, which meant she didn't have to take the bus to work anymore. She could pick up shifts without worrying about whether public transportation would get her there on time. The dark circles under her eyes started to fade. She smiled more often, but more than the money, something else had shifted. David had found his voice, not just in music but in life. He spoke up more in class. He joined conversations. He discovered that when you stop being afraid of being seen, life becomes less about survival and more about actually living. Spring arrived, and with it came the annual Winter Gala, the city's biggest music event, held at the historic Riverside Theater downtown. It was where professional musicians performed, where the city's wealthiest residents gathered in formal attire to support the arts. And this year, David had been invited to perform. When the invitation arrived in the mail, David had stared at it for a full 5 minutes, convinced it was some kind of mistake. But it was real. The scholarship committee that had funded the talent show prize wanted him to perform at the gala as a featured artist. They'd heard about the university scholarship offer and wanted to showcase local talent. His mom had insisted they go shopping for the occasion. They couldn't afford much, but she'd been saving a little money from each paycheck, hiding it away for something special. At the thrift store, they found a black suit jacket that fit him almost perfectly. It was slightly worn at the elbows, but nothing noticeable. With a white shirt and the dress pants he already owned, David looked like a different person. The night of the gala, David stood backstage at the Riverside Theater, and the fear tried to creep back in. This wasn't a high school auditorium full of teenagers. This was a professional venue. Real musicians performed here, famous ones. He peeked out at the audience and saw people in tuxedos and evening gowns. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Everything looked expensive and important. David suddenly felt very small and very out of place. "Hey, you okay?" David turned to see Tyler standing behind him in a suit and tie. David had given him a ticket, and Tyler had actually come. Not just Tyler, but a whole group from school. Ashley was there with some of the other dance team girls. Kevin, who'd once doubted David could play at all, was sitting with his parents. Mrs. Patterson was in the third row. Even some of the kids who used to ignore him completely had shown up to support him. "Just nervous," David admitted. Tyler put a hand on his shoulder. "Remember the talent show? You walked out there with everyone doubting you, and you absolutely crushed it. You've got this, man. You've always had this," the words helped. David took a deep breath and nodded. When his name was announced, David walked onto that stage with his head held high. The applause was polite and formal, so different from the wild cheering at the talent show. These people didn't know him. They were here to judge him, to see if this local kid was actually worth their time and attention. David sat at the grand piano. It was the most beautiful instrument he'd ever touched, polished to perfection, perfectly in tune, responsive to even the slightest touch. For a moment, he just appreciated it. Then he began to play. He'd chosen something different this time, a piece by Rachmaninoff, incredibly difficult and emotionally powerful, but he'd also woven in elements of his own composition again, creating something that honored the classical tradition while adding his own voice to it. From the very first note, David knew something was different. He wasn't playing out of fear or desperation anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was simply sharing something beautiful, something true. His fingers danced across the keys with confidence he hadn't possessed 6 months ago. The music filled the theater, rich and full and alive. He could feel the audience leaning forward, drawn in by the passion and skill of the performance. When David played now, he thought about his journey. He thought about Mr. Rodriguez and those first lessons. He thought about all those lonely lunch periods in the old music room. He thought about his mom and her endless sacrifices. He thought about the moment he'd almost given up, standing on that stage at the talent show with people laughing at him. And he thought about how none of that had stopped him. The doubts, the fear, the poverty, the invisibility, none of it had been strong enough to kill his love for music. That's what he poured into this performance. Not just technical skill, but the story of refusing to give up on himself. The piece built to its climax, David's whole body moving with the music, his fingers flying across the keys and passages that most pianists spent years mastering. Then it descended into the gentle, melancholic ending. The final notes hung in the air like a question, then slowly faded into silence. The applause that followed was different from the talent show. It wasn't wild or chaotic. It was sustained and powerful, a standing ovation from an audience that knew music, that understood what they'd just witnessed. These weren't just people being supportive. These were people genuinely moved by art. David stood and bowed, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Not because he'd proven himself to anyone, but because he'd finally proven something to himself, that he was worth believing in, that his voice mattered, that the quiet kid from the trailer park had something valuable to share with the world. After the performance, people surrounded him. The director of the gala shook his hand and told him he had a standing invitation to perform anytime. A music journalist asked to interview him for the local paper. Several audience members wanted to know where he studied, shocked to learn he was largely self-taught. His mom found him in the crowd, and they hugged tightly, She didn't need to say anything. The pride in her eyes said everything. Professor Mitchell from the university was there too. "That settles it," he said with a huge smile. "You're going to do incredible things, David. I can't wait to see what the next few years bring." The next few months flew by in a blur. David finished his senior year of high school, no longer invisible but not quite comfortable with all the attention either. He graduated with decent grades and a future that once seemed impossible. Summer came, and with it, preparation for university. His mom helped him pack his things, both of them trying not to cry. The apartment would feel empty without him, but she insisted she'd be fine. The community had rallied around her after David's story spread. Joe's Diner had promoted her to manager, which came with better pay and more reasonable hours. "You gave me hope again," she told him the night before he left. "Watching you chase your dreams reminded me that good things can happen, that hard work pays off, that we're not stuck in one place forever." Move-in day at the university was overwhelming. The campus was huge and beautiful. The School of Music was housed in a building that looked like a palace. David's dorm room was small but comfortable. He had a roommate named Chris who played violin and seemed genuinely excited to meet him. The first few weeks were an adjustment. College was harder than high school. The other music students were incredibly talented, many of them having trained since childhood at prestigious music schools. David sometimes felt out of his depth, but then he'd remember where he came from. He'd remember teaching himself from library books and YouTube videos. He'd remember that old out-of-tune piano in the abandoned music room. He'd remember standing on that stage at the talent show with people laughing at him and choosing to play anyway. Those memories reminded him that he'd already overcome the hardest part, believing in himself when nobody else did. David's piano teacher at the university, Dr. Anderson, was demanding but fair. After the first month, she pulled him aside after a lesson. "You have gaps in your training," she said bluntly. "Things that students who had formal lessons since childhood learned years ago. But you also have something many of them lack. You have heart. You play like someone who knows what it means to need music, not just want it. That's rare. That's special." She was right. Over the next few years, David worked harder than he'd ever worked before. He filled in those gaps in his training. He learned proper technique, music theory at an advanced level, composition, performance practice, but he never lost the thing that made his playing unique, that raw emotional honesty that came from his journey. By his junior year, David was performing regularly at university concerts and local events. By his senior year, he was winning competitions and catching the attention of concert halls in bigger cities. The trajectory of his life had completely changed from that scared 17-year-old kid who could barely afford lunch. But David never forgot where he came from. He started volunteering at community centers in low-income neighborhoods, teaching piano to kids who couldn't afford lessons. He saw himself in their eyes, that hunger to create something beautiful, that fear that they weren't good enough or didn't belong in the world of classical music. "You belong here," he'd tell them. "Your voice matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Years later, David would think back to that talent show, the moment that changed everything. Not because he won or because people finally saw him, but because he chose to show up. He chose to be vulnerable. He chose to believe that his music was worth sharing, even when everything in his life told him to stay small and invisible and safe. That choice had opened doors he never knew existed. But more importantly, it had taught him that the biggest obstacles we face are usually the ones we build in our own minds. The fear, the doubt, the voice that says we're not good enough. David learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's playing anyway. It's sitting down at that piano even when your hands are shaking and your heart is pounding and everyone's watching and waiting for you to fail. It's choosing to be seen, even when being invisible feels safer. And sometimes, just sometimes when you make that choice, everything changes. Not just for you, but for everyone watching who needed to see that it's possible.